Hello, and welcome to this I Thrive webinar series called Planning Your Exit Strategy, where we hope to inspire you to plan and execute your daily business with the end in mind. This session is called Positioning My Practice for Success. I'm Scott Jentz from my executive coaching service called Sandbox, and as always, am thrilled to serve as moderator of this I Thrive series. It's once again a pleasure to introduce a featured expert. Today, it's Dr. Brandon Blaker from Texas. His practice is Hill Country Vision Center, where he grew it from a multi-location group to the foundation for a regional eye care group. Dr. Blaker is as focused of an optometrist in practice performance that I've ever met, and I'm really grateful that he will be giving you strong insights. Welcome, Brandon, to our I Thrive series.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the I Thrive community and this important topic about practices and exit strategies and what we can do to make life better for you.
Well, we're really grateful that you'll be willing to share that. And in this installment, audience, we're going to be reviewing the various methods that an OD practice owner can use to leverage ahead of any practice transition. And so the goal is to help you find ways to add value to your practice today so they can maximize your value at exit. And so let's go ahead and get started. Brandon, when we first met, you were giving me some interesting thoughts around a phrase you learned, which is you must run your business like you're trying to sell it or you aren't running it. I would really love for you to dig into that a little bit for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's an important topic because as optometrists, wherever we're at in our career, and especially as we get a little deeper into our career, 15, 20, 25 years often, things can feel like they're getting a little bit monotonous. And so we fall into a comfortable routine, no different from myself or anybody out there that's listening. And so we're doing good. Our practice may be paid off, it may be not, but we're making a good salary. We have a good staff and things are chugging along pretty good. And you tend to lose a little bit of sight of the details that are happening on a day-to-day basis. And almost as from a fact of, is it worth the effort to put into it for what I might get out of it? And so that was one of the things that became really important to us as we kind of began down this road of selling our practices, is what can we do to make our practices better? And we realized pretty quickly that we weren't running our business like we were trying to sell it. And that comes from a top end revenue standpoint, but also, what your net profits are at the end of the year. And so it took a real holistic approach to what are we doing to maximize our revenue on a day-to-day basis, and then understanding how to utilize a P&L and read a P&L to know what are we spending money on that maybe we don't need to spend money on, and is it really making us profits, and really begin to utilize that type of thinking of, if I put money here, am I making money because of it? And once you start to look at that, you'll realize that you're spending a lot of money on things in your office that aren't necessarily making you money. And so that became kind of our main focus going forward over the year or more that we were in this process to sell our practice, of really fine tuning all the details and understanding what we were good at, what we weren't so good at, and then going from there.
So doctors often get together with peer groups or other entities and focus on optimizing their business. But you would submit that you literally think about it, maybe even 5 or 7 years in, like, hey, what would this look like if I was going to actually sell it and exit it? Because It changes how sharp you put the edge on the knife.
Absolutely. Yeah. So my wife would really get annoyed at me at many points during this process, because the first thing I would do in the morning before I ever left the house is I would sit at my desk and I'd be looking at the previous day's data dump into our analytics system and go, okay, what did we do yesterday? How did the numbers shift? Where did things go? And she was like, can't you just let it go for one day? And I'm like, no, I can't. This is, as I really began to see the results of what we were putting in, then it became addictive to show that I can make these improvements up and down the line through the P&L from, like I said, revenue growth and, savings along the way.
And I can't help myself but to ask one more thing a different way. Mm-hmm. The average 5 or 10, maybe even 15-year-in doc is maybe not even thinking about the day that they'll sell. They're just going to transition.
Right.
But you would encourage them to really think about it. Like you said, you get in that
Right.
next day, you might even be a little hyper and annoying about how detailed, but think about it that way. What can you give an example of one of those pieces of data that just matters as much on year 5 as it does the day before you exit? I'd be curious if you have one at the tip of your tongue.
Well, let me go back to a second to what you said, because one of the important things is you don't know when that event is going to take place in your life, of when you do need to sell your practice or when you might need to sell your practice. It may have nothing to do with private equity or sales. It can be a change in family life. It can be any number of things that happen. So if you're not working on it when you need to be working on it, when that time, whatever the surprise might be, comes up, you're ready to move and maximize your returns on it. I think from a metrics perspective, I think the one thing that often that I see over and over again as I consult with practices and work with people gets out of control is staffing costs. And that's, people oftentimes when they're going through their day, they run into problems in their practice for one reason or another, and they feel like, well, maybe I've got some issues related to billing, or I don't have patients flowing through the practice the way I should. And so whatever there may be a bottleneck or a problem in the practice, the default reaction is add more people. And so instead of improving the operations processes that occur in the practice, often the default reaction is let's just add another person in there. And so you're not solving the problem, you're just simply adding debt to your practice. And so that's one of the things that I found over years of in my own practice and working. The better your staff is, the leaner you run, the more effective your people tend to be, and they tend to weed themselves out. You're far better off looking and saying, where do I have maybe a problem with patient flow or optical sales or things like that in my practice? And is necessarily adding another person the right thing to do? Or is there an operational efficiency that I can gain by doing something different in my practice? Whether it be, using a data analytics system to allow you to see where you're doing good or doing bad, or just stepping back for a few days sometimes and just watching patient flow from a different perspective in your practice, you can gain some real insights into what's working and what's not.
What hits me there is thinking about a staffing need under the optics of, if I was to add it because I thought I needed it, would somebody who would buy my practice want it? I think that's just a fascinating way to look at it.
Yeah, it is.
So go ahead if you're going to add it.
No, I know. I was going to say, because the way we may look at things is very different than what a private equity consolidator may look at things. That you look at something as, whether it be a scribe you have in your office, you look at that and you go, well, I need this. It's going to make my day a little bit easier. And that's one of those things that I always see real heavy volume practices do, is they add a scribe to their office. But what I often see is that heavy volume practice really isn't seeing all that many more patients than the average Joe seeing in their office. They've just decided they wanted a scribe to make their day easier. But what happens is that $30,000 salary that you're running on that scribe gets taken away out of your net profits, and at a reasonable multiple, you're talking, hundreds of thousands of dollars of lost value in your practice because of that. So when I look at, I tell people, are you willing to work a little bit harder during your day and maybe learn to punch your EHR keys yourself and go, do your stuff? Is it worth several $100,000 at the end of the day? And when you put it into the perspective of knowing that every dollar you save or you're not spending on something that, isn't necessarily a necessity, sometimes it is, but not always it isn't always a necessity, is taking away value from your practice. I think that's an important way to look at it. And that's the way we began to look at it, is if I'm spending money here, whatever my return multiple is on my practice, is it worth that money I spent? And most of the time it wasn't.
So let's shift a little bit. You started thinking in this manner of, building my practice every day like it'd be an exit. And you got to the point where it was attractive to some outside entities. Right. And before you get it all the way into that, could you explain what drove you to think about looking for a prospective buyer? Was it that somebody knocked on your door, right, or was there another way about it? What happened?
Well, it's actually a funny story, because I wasn't even in town when it happened. I was out of town in Florida, and my wife was seeing patients, and not to name names, but let's say a very large retail establishment came knocking on the door saying they wanted to partner with our practice. And basically my wife said, thanks, no thanks, took their card, threw it in the trash. And then when I got back from Florida, she just happened to tell me the story. And I said, well, wait a second, what trash can did you throw that in? Because I want to know what the story is here. And so it really kind of piqued my interest of why is this national retailer talking to private practices about partnering with them? And so that kind of gave me my first idea that maybe that the world we live in is changing a little bit. And so I talked to them, met with them, kind of understood. I didn't really know what an EBITDA was. I didn't know what a multiple was. I just wanted to know what the story was. And the story is we'll pay you X number of dollars times however much money you make. And that was really the kind of key
bottom line EBITDA.
Bottom line, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If you're making $100,000, we're going to pay you X 100,000. And so at that point, that really kind of keyed me in that something had changed. And I had reached out to some good sources that I had in the industry and said, hey, what's going on? This retailer just said, hey, we want to buy your practices. And so at that point, I kind of understood that, the market was changing and that I needed to really change the way that I thought about how I ran my business, because we had grown into multiple locations and we're doing a lot of top line revenue. But as I looked and understood what bottom line revenue was supposed to look like, we weren't as competitive and as attractive as we probably should have been at those numbers.
All right, so that's interesting. I mean, you get this interesting, completely out of the blue request. It starts to make you feel like, hey, listen, I can work on this. Yep. And back to our original phrase. So you did some things over the course of 3 years. You focused on optimization. Give the audience a bit of a sense of the things that you worked on.
Yeah. So one of the things we looked at is how effective we were doing certain things in the practice. And I would say the easiest thing, and many of you are aware of the metric of just looking at your AR capture rate. And I was like, that's something that we can, it's easy to track. It's easy for the staff to understand. And it's a pretty strong building block for us. It's something that I knew we were below where we should be. So I said, let's come up with a plan to tackle this metric and see what we can't do. So with our multiple locations, we had set up a little bit of competitiveness between our practices, that whoever could come up with the highest, rate received a little bit of a bonus, or I should say a bigger bonus, because they beat everybody. And each office had their own goals of, whoever had the highest AR coding rates between our opticians, they received bonuses. So we did little things like that to really start to push that individual metric. And before I knew it, we had opticians that were 100% AR coding rates doing that. And so we learned pretty quickly that just by kind of shifting and putting a little bit of focus into some of the numbers that we were able to capture, we could make some huge improvements in what we were doing from a top and bottom line revenue pass through. But what we learned, interestingly, is after, say 3-4 weeks of doing this, we would say, okay, we had got our numbers where we want them to. Now, what do we do? So we would come up with another parameter, and that may be, high-end progressive lens sales, or second pair sales, or blue light lenses, any number of things that you can look at on your practice and say, okay, well, let's make this better, because you start to get a little bit excited. You saw some improvement. Everybody's kind of excited about what you're doing, and so you would jump to something else. And ironically, as it would happen, is when we would jump to a different focus, the first focus that we had would always drop down a little bit. They would start underperforming where they had previously been. And so it was kind of like, okay, we moved somewhere else and they forgot what they were doing. And so after 3-4 weeks, many times we would have to come back again to what we were originally doing and say, okay, AR as a company was at 75%. You guys dropped down to 55% over the last 4 weeks. So let's get back on the AR coding bandwagon again. And what would happen is after we would do that, and we would kind of jump back and forth several times, we noticed that whatever we had been working on 2, 3, 4 times in a row, we stopped losing that metric and stopped dropping back down again. And it became more of a second nature for people to offer them, as combination packages and things like that. So it became less of a sales tactic and more of, this is what we sell, this will work for you best. And so we found ourselves cumulatively at that point building upon the KPIs that we were interested in, and we didn't have the big drop-offs that we were having originally.
And you really need to lead this from the top, I assume, that you can
Yes.
have the best opticians and managers, but you got to have constant attention and constant presence.
Yes. So I would have, because not only would we work on it from an individual perspective, but we had goals of growth per, how many patient growth we saw over a quarter. We would have top end revenue growth that we would be expected to meet. And so we would have, basically a profit sharing set up where if we were up 15% in top end growth, then we would share a portion of that growth back to the entire staff. And that included front desk, lab people, opticians, techs, you name it. That went across everybody, because it's not going to be just one area of focus. If your opticians are great, but your front desk people are not good at recalling patients or scheduling or booking, mom calls in to get, Susie an eye exam and she's got 4 other kids and you don't book those 4 other kids, that's something that's not helping growth. So it became a process of where the techs were doing better with their optos capture rates and all those type of things. And so when the whole group knew that they had to participate and to make those big bonus numbers for profit sharing, that's when things really got exciting in the office. And there was really a sense of camaraderie that happened in the office and accountability that happened, because if you had somebody that wasn't, because there were instances where we would miss our quarter bonus rates by $1,000, a few $100, and there would have been a week in there where somebody didn't call pre-appoints or something like that. The staff knew it and they were mad about it. And so there was a certain accountability that would happen in the practice that really made the teamwork work. And the interesting way we did it is we, as a profit sharing group, they would get a lump sum of money, and that money was divided among every staff member. So they were actually benefited by not overstaffing, as I go back to earlier, because if they have too many staff, they've got to share all that money with a whole lot of people. But if they work harder and more efficiently when doing it, they benefit from being more efficient at what they do.
So as one other follow-up to this, you have to have a way of measuring. What did you do? What have you done, or what do you use to measure?
So it was funny because we used OfficeMate as our primary system in our office. And I always knew that record keeping and monitoring KPIs was important. It was just extraordinarily difficult to do. I would have to print my own reports, extract them to Excel, and then try to figure something out. And if I could get 1 month out of every 2 or 3 quarters, I was doing pretty good. Yeah. And then I went to Vision Expo West one year, and I walked by Edge Pro booth, and I was like, wow, this looks pretty interesting. So Ed Buffington was there, and he and I got to talking a little bit, and he was showing me, what the system did. And I remember I told my wife, she was standing right there, I was like, we're adding this right now. I was like, this is exactly what we need to understand what we're doing. And to say that it made the biggest improvement in what we did in our practice and made us more profitable than I could have ever dreamed is an understatement, to say the least. There's a saying, you can't hit a goal if you don't measure what you're doing.
Right.
And so we always had ideas, and everybody out there is the same. You always have an idea of you want to do better and you want to perform as well as you can, but you don't really know where to start. And for me to be able to just click, drop down, see what's going on was huge for us. And I can say one of the biggest things that it did, it allowed us to train our staff better than we ever could have dreamed. And this goes from doctors all the way to opticians, because one of the things that we noticed is we always had a few high performing opticians in our practices that were keeping our numbers at a pretty good average rate. And then we had a few in there that were just basically doing nothing. They had very low AR coding percentages. They had, terrible revenue per frame sales. They had huge $0 frame numbers. They had their metrics were really bad. And so what it allowed us to do is then say, okay, instead of just having maybe an office meeting or something where we say, hey, this is important to us, we can go directly to that person and say, look, this is where you're at. This is where your colleagues are at. This is where the national average is at. This isn't working, whatever you're doing. So let's figure out your spiel, what your talk, what are you trying to sell? And I remember probably one of the best results we had is we had one optician who, she was almost 0% AR sales. And it was just so bad. But she was one of my favorite opticians. I mean, she had a great personality. She was just this wonderful person. And I'm thinking, how is this happening? How is this wonderful personality who seems to love what she's doing have this metric that is so bad? So I went and talked to her and I said, hey, let's talk about this and see what's going on. And she was like, well, I just feel like a used car salesman selling AR coding to people. And I said, okay. I said, do you have AR coding on your glasses? Of course I do. When you got glasses for your family, do you put AR coding on them? Of course we do. I was like, then why wouldn't you, recommend that to your patients and things like that? So I think that, being able to recognize when something is a little bit off and having that conversation, and she was one of the first opticians we ever had that went to 100% AR coding at any given month.
Well, I mean, picking a measuring system, being committed to a measuring system, and then sharing it, right? This ability to share this information with your staff, it's like the old adage, if you want to measure weight, don't give somebody a ruler. And if you want to measure a height,
Right.
don't give somebody a scale. I'm not going to get this right, but in the movie Caddyshack, Ty Webb, Chevy Chase's character is not caring about his golf score. And Danny says to him, well, if you don't keep counting your score, how do you measure yourself against other golfers? And he simply says, by height, and walks away. Right. And that's a great punchline because it's subtle. But the point is that there are different ways to measure things, but you got to pick one. You got to be committed to it. And then everyone's got to know it. So it's really awesome that you not only had a system, but you involved your team and they use your dashboard or your measuring system to look at it.
And they would call us all the time. They all had my cell phone number. I'd get emails, Dr. Blaker, where are we at this month? We're 1 week away from the quarter. How much what's our daily average to meet our goals?
That's awesome.
And so they would come in all the time and be like, show me the AR coding this month. And so they wanted to know, it's just like kids in video games. Kids get addicted to video games because there's a scoreboard to it. Yeah. And so if in your office, if you have a scoreboard and they can see what they're doing and how they're performing, people like doing good. People like being recognized for being successful at what they do, and people don't like being last. And so, when they can visualize, hey, I'm doing really good and I'm carrying my weight around here, it provides some professional feedback that they're good at what they do.
So now we'll go from how you optimize your practice, where every dollar that you found of extra revenue or reduced expense gave you a multiple benefit on valuation, to actually going through a process. So a bunch of people have come into this video because they're curious about what that process is like. And if you could explain that in some steps, that would be useful.
Yeah. So I think an important part is having somebody who's a professional at this be on your side. Okay. And so I think having a good brokerage firm, especially if you are a large platform and you've got a lot of moving parts as you're dealing with leases.
Meaning multiple locations,
multiple doctors. There's a lot of emotion, a lot of personalities involved. I think having someone in your corner to reassure you as you're going through this process is a huge asset. And so that there were many times that I was going through this that I felt like I knew I was too emotionally involved. And so I'd have to step back and rely on legal counsel, consulting counsel, brokerage counsel, accounting, you name it. So you need to really have a good idea of what you want out of it, and then have a team around you that is supporting you in that single goal. And so I think that there's some instances where maybe some of the smaller practices or single acquisitions, they do get away without using brokerage firms and things like that. But if you're serious about really maximizing your returns on it, I think having someone in your corner is good. And contrary to popular belief, most of the time the private equity firms actually prefer working with some of the brokerage firms because it makes their job easier. They don't have to deal with the emotional doctor that's getting, too carried away with whatever's going on. They don't really understand the dynamics of the negotiation that's happening. And so they have maybe unrealistic expectations of what should occur. And I think that's where good counsel really helps both sides of the process of setting the doctor up, knowing what this is going to look like, and then them already having an established relationship with all the buyers that are on the market and knowing what buttons they can push on each side of it to make sure that the deal happens smoothly.
I would think the other advantage of having a broker or representative in the process is that you can really just continue to hyper focus on the practice in the process.
You can. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's a very detailed process that you go through. I was very overwhelmed at
distractions.
It's constant. You've got to provide explanations to your P&Ls, and that's why I think knowing your business is so important, because you're going to have to validate a lot of the things that go on in your office. And if you don't know what's happening when the questions come up and they say, okay, well, what did you spend XYZ dollars for on this? If you don't know the answer, then it's not going to benefit you. And so I think that there are the issue that's going on right now is this is a very volatile market. There's a ton of people trying to buy practices. There's hundreds of ODs that are wanting to sell practices. And so to use a term, there's a lot of fish in the water and there's a lot of sharks swimming around too. So there's a lot of people that are involved that have got into the brokerage business of selling practices who don't necessarily know what they're doing, if I can say it, so bluntly. So I think it's important to understand that just because someone has been a consultant before or has had some private practice consulting experience doesn't mean they have a lot of brokerage experience. So I think you want to make sure that, whoever you use has a lot of brokerage experience, has done a lot of private equity deals. Having some OD to OD transaction experience is good. But doing an OD to OD transaction is extremely different than doing an OD to private equity transaction. You need to have someone who's representing you understands those differences.
One last thing about using a representative, do they sometimes open opportunities for prospective buyers, alternative buyers, and thus a price competition that you wouldn't get if you were on your own?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when you look at selling your practice, there's always going to be, and not always, but in most cases, there are going to be a couple of players in that market. And so the role of the broker is to importantly understand what your goals are, understand how you want to practice day one after you sell. And what is your comfort level of a practice that's going to basically change nothing and allow you just to show up the next day and you just keep doing what you're doing and there's really no difference and you just go about your business, versus someone who's coming in and changing the name of your practice, changing all your goods and services used, doing those type of things. Those are very different personalities of people. There's some people that don't care, just they're like, give me the highest bidder, let's get everybody involved, and whoever pays the most money is who I'm selling to. But there's other people who are a little bit more cautious about the change that they're willing to accept post-transactionally. And some of that depends on age of the person selling. I was 45 years old when I sold all my locations. So I had a horizon and I knew there would be a time that I was going to still be working and seeing patients in my practice. So I was very careful about the consolidator that I chose to go with, of what I knew and what I thought my practice would look like day one, day 360, 3-4 years from now, as opposed to, maybe I get a little bit more money if I go to someone else who's going to drastically change my practice. Am I going to be comfortable the next day when I walk in and everything around me's changed, and I don't have I'm a kind of a small fish in a big pond at that point. And so I think that's important to, as you have representation, the broker's going to talk to you about what each of these different consolidators provides, and understanding your personality and say, okay, you sound like you might be a good fit for this group here, or this group here, or this group here. But we're still going to get everybody involved to maximize your returns. And ultimately, you need to see what the offers are from many different people to make a real decision about works for you. And I think from a brokerage standpoint, the brokers ethically, you have to ensure that they don't have, deals or equity deals in place with people where they're getting paid from certain private equity groups, because they would love nothing more than to, have a deal with somebody where they just funnel all their clients to them. So you got to make sure that there's no conflict of interest associated with whomever you use to represent you. And then be very careful about, as you're going through it, the paperwork that you sign. As you're starting up, sometimes, everybody's going to want you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And you want that too, because you don't want people just walking around talking about your practice. But you want to make sure that the non-disclosure agreement is truly just a non-disclosure agreement, and doesn't have some sort of representation agreement into it as well, because I have seen that happen before. So you want to just make sure that whoever's representing you has experience in the market, has your best interest at heart. Talk to them. Make sure you have kind of a good personal connection with them, that somebody you could pick up the phone and talk to, and is going to work for you.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about this total opportunity assessment. I mean, I would think a lot of ODs look at a PE sales opportunity as a way to create financial stability, period. Right. Sure. But you've talked now about these various ways of looking at different buyers and what the post-sale process looks like, including employment. Mm-hmm. And opportunity to gain, financial benefit outside the sale of the practice. Talk a little bit about what it's like to go through the process of preparing for the post-sale reality.
Yeah, it's not easy. I mean, you're going to have some sleepless nights through it. And I get phone calls all the time, and I always make myself available to people that I've never met before to talk through this, because it was no different by myself. When I sold, I was the first person in Texas to ever sell to a private equity group that was based in Texas. And so I didn't know anybody. I didn't have anybody I could pick up the phone and say, hey, what about this? What happens when this happens? I was just, cross my fingers and hope for the best on it. But I think it's important to, like I said, understand what you're looking for, and then make sure that you talk to maybe some of the other buyers or people that have sold to those groups. There's plenty of people that you can reach out to find out really what the expectation has been, and to get just a better idea of what it looks like. For the most part, and I can say this pretty broadly, most of the private equity groups don't change a lot. They're the best way I can explain, because this is the number one topic that I always seem to come up, is what's going to happen. Are they going to fire all my staff the next day? Are they going to bring in a bunch of people that don't know what they're doing? So I kind of asked the person, the OD, to step back a little bit and say, is there anything in your life, a prized possession that you've ever won? Maybe it's a car or a boat or a house, and that you're going to go out and you want it so bad in a competitive market that you're going to overpay versus somebody else on this specific product. And then the day you buy it, go in, whether it's, let's say you bought an old Corvette. The day you bought it, you go in and buy this beautiful Corvette, and you take the engine out, you change the seats, you change the radio, you change everything, and you rip out everything that you loved about this car and the reason you overpaid for it to make it something that it's not. That doesn't make sense. And that's kind of the same thing that happens in these private equity transactions, is they're buying you for the money that you make. They're buying you because you're profitable at what you do. And so it makes zero sense for them to go in and get rid of your staff, to change your hours, to do the things that has made your office successful, to go in and just wreck it, because that just ruins their investment. These guys wouldn't be some of the best business people in our industry and finance and to do something like that, because as soon as they started doing it, they would immediately see their investment values fall down. And so I think that's kind of the reassurance that, I had going through this process, talking to the CEO of our company, and I asked him the same question. I was like, what does it look like for me the next day? And his explanation is, we love your practice, or we wouldn't be buying it. So why am I going to go in and just shred things and change it? And so it took me kind of stepping back in that perspective and looking at it as if I was going to buy something of great value. Why would I go in and just mess it all up?
Well, and in almost every case, they really value you, the doctor,
Absolutely.
and the relationship. So doctors need to get out of their minds that these opportunities are a chance to
Right.
just sort of turn in the keys.
Yeah.
And so you kind of end up with what, a couple years employment agreement for security of both
Sure.
parties. Is that something?
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on the buyer. I mean, generally, you're going to have a 3 to 5 year employment agreement that's going to be part of your sales. You can't sell and not stay on, because you're the biggest asset that you have. Right. And so they're buying your ability to generate revenue and your name that they're buying. They understand that without you being there, that this simply doesn't work. It doesn't work for you, and it doesn't work for them. And they want you to have skin in the game. They want you to have some responsibility in what goes on forward. So almost all the contracts are going to have some production responsibility to it, meaning that whatever you produce, you're going to get paid some percentage of that. And so that way they don't want you to just sit there and say, okay, here's a flat fee contract, and I'm going to kick up my feet and be a zero participant in this. They want to make sure that you're going to stay on and perform. And you have that responsibility. I mean, they paid you a heavy premium for your practice. You owe it to them to stay on and work and to be a good performer for them. I think it's important to look at this from a time frame. And I hear this often is people will say, well, I'm not ready to sell right now. I want to retire in 3 or 4 years. Good. That's the perfect time. You need to be selling right now. Because if you wait 3 or 4 years and then you decide I'm done, guess what? You have a 3 to 5 year extension on your contract that you're going to have to sign when you sell your practice to get top dollar for your practice. So your 3 to 4 year timeline just went to 8 years from when you actually want to sell your practice. So the good thing is take the money now, in my opinion. Take it now, put it to work in investments, and then still make a very, very strong production-based salary over the time at which you want to continue to work. And trust me, I mean, we haven't got to the point yet where I have to renew my contract, but they're going to want me to stay and work. Whoever owns you doesn't want you to leave. They don't want to find another doctor. They don't want to replace you with somebody cheaper, because there's no value in that. If they save $20,000 on a new OD and they lose 25% of their patients, how does that work? That's not a smart decision. And so I think as ODs, we're a little bit cynical in thinking that, somebody's always out to get us about something. But I've had a fantastic run of it at this point, and have really enjoyed my time after I'd sold my practice.
So as hard as it may be, especially that you're in a situation where you are an employee after selling, if you could just really pull back far and say, all right, there's probably a negative or two, to go to a seller. Sure. And as opposed to just keeping your path or finding a junior associate doing the traditional transaction, is there a negative or two you can share?
I would say the biggest negative for me, and it's going to be different from everybody, but the biggest for me is taking back and backing away and not having control of every scenario that happens. As an entrepreneur, my day was made by solving problems and fixing things and making the best of what I could. And you have to learn to back away from that, because you don't have control of the situation anymore. You sold your practice. And so the hard part is seeing the new district managers or regional managers or the people that are now involved in your practice revisiting some of the mistakes that you made early in your career, from a practice standpoint, whether it be through merchandising, marketing, those type of things that, it's kind of like a little kid, they've got to prove to themselves that, you keep sticking your finger in the light socket, eventually you're going to shock yourself. And so, as someone who had been in the same location for 16 years, I know what works in my practices. And it's not that I'm not open to other good ideas because our practice has grown dramatically since we've sold our practice. But sometimes it's hard watching somebody say, hey, I've got an idea to let's do this. And I'm sitting there going, that's not going to work. I've done that. I've been trying to do that for 20 years and it didn't work. And so that's hard to, not constantly try to maybe interrupt the people that are trying to run your business and just let them do what they need to do. It's getting easier. But that's still from a personality like mine, I always want to be involved in stuff. And so taking myself out of the picture was the hardest part.
That's really helpful. All right. So I would say let's try to wrap up with this. To any OD, regardless of what their next year or 5 years looks like, you've really given strong advice to focus on the practice and get into the details and care about the details.
Right.
But, would you advise a doctor to actually sort of start thinking about searching for buyers, sort of early in their thought process, or optimize the practice and know that they got to have the extension of their career and then go look, like, where in this process do I think, all right, I got a $1.2 million practice. I think it's time to look. I'm 47. Maybe I should just get it better for another couple years, or do I start looking now and make it better over time? Because people don't want to play their cards too early. How do you do?
Well, and it's funny you say that, because like I said, if we go back to my story, when I wasn't looking for anybody to buy my practice, I didn't even know this existed. And so as I started going through this process, I realized that this was going to take some time. This wasn't something that I was just going to snap my fingers and all of a sudden I was going to have this hugely profitable practice that I was going to make millions of dollars on when I sold my practice. That wasn't going to happen overnight. But I think if you start slowly understanding how to optimize your KPIs and your P&Ls, you kind of get into a rhythm with it. And it doesn't take all that long to then start budgeting and forecasting what your optimization is going to look like over some period of time. And so for us, as the first few months went through this process, and we started looking at the next year's budget, how we were growing, where we were being successful at, and then started multiplying that times a multiplier of EBITDA, you started realizing, well, gosh, if I do this over X number of months or years, I'm really going to increase the value of the practice. And I can tell you, from the point at which I started doing this, and we had some rough estimates of what my practice was worth, we actually ended up selling for almost 3 times more than that initial value. So there's definitely reason to do this. Now, even if we're not talking about a private equity transaction, and you're talking about an OD to OD transaction, or you're talking about bringing in an associate and phasing yourself out, you deserve to make as much money you can out of your business as you can. And I say business from a perspective is most of us don't look at our practices as businesses. We look at it as a job. And I think that's one of the first things you have to do is start looking at your practice as a business, and then figure out how to run your business as efficient as you can. Because if you bring in another OD and you pay them, $110,000 a year, you're going to live off of what the remaining value of it is. And you're going to realize real quick, in many cases, most people realize, I can't afford to hire this guy. If I'm going to hire this person or this woman to come in and be a doctor in my practice, how am I going to live off of what's left over? Because there's not a lot left over, because I haven't ran my practice effectively. The same thing in an OD to OD transaction. Your practice is, generally not as valuable to an OD to OD because, for one, most ODs aren't willing to pay anywhere close to what a private equity transaction would bring you. But even if you, from some moral high ground, you decided from a professional standpoint you wanted to transfer it to another OD, your practice is still more valuable if it's more profitable. And so there's no reason not from today forward to come up with a plan to incentivize staff, incentivize doctors, review capture rates, make sure you're doing all the things that you should be doing to make your practice more valuable. Because even if you decide you go down this road and you start talking to private equity consolidators, and you realize, hey, this maybe isn't for me right now. Maybe I'm too young and I want to do this. the amount of revenue that you would make over a period of time of 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years is cumulative, is amazing if you just run your practice more effectively. I think since we're specifically talking about private equity exit strategies, I think it's important to also mention that as most of these consolidators come into a market, the markets heat up fast. And so I know Austin is a market that's starting to heat up pretty quick right now in our area. So what happens is that nobody wants to let the other guy have their foot in the door and make a big entrance right away. So you get a couple of guys that are trying to fight for a market, and they don't want to be the one that's left holding the bag and not taking any of these practices. So and I've seen it in San Antonio market where we were, Houston, where we have a lot of practices, is the people that tend to get in right away as that volatility is heating up in the market are the ones that tend to really benefit early and get the higher multiples. Because what happens is once somebody's come into a market and they own 15, 20 locations there, the other groups aren't near as excited to come in and try to pick off 1 or 2 practices in that area. And the group that already owns 20 already has such a huge competitive advantage that you're just picking up 1s and 2s right here. They don't have a need to pay some really high multiple early on to get to pick up a few extra practices. So I think that I hear a lot of doctors say, well, I'll wait and see, the multiples will go up over time. They won't. There's so many things that can go on, whether it be political, economic, that can change, in a heartbeat. Look what COVID did. And so I think, my wife came home one day and in the middle of COVID and we weren't seeing patients. She goes, boy, I'm glad we don't own our practices anymore, because we didn't have to worry about the issues that were going on. And so I think it's important for people to be in communication with a broker, with people that are in the market, to understand where their market is at. And then if they're really serious about selling their practice, get in while the getting's good. Because that's where I've seen the highest multiples come from, is in when markets get hot, everybody's bidding for those practices. And then once they sell, it cools down and the 1s and 2s are picked up at much lower multiples.
Well, Brandon, the iThrive community can't thank you enough for your story. The fact is that there's a great story and great advice around how to operate in this environment of practice consolidation, but you also have these incredibly helpful pearls about really honing in on the key parts of measuring and managing your business. Yes. And so thanks for being so transparent and insightful. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Anytime.
All right. Well, to the audience, thank you for attending this iThrive webinar. This series is called Planning Your Exit Strategy, and there are other installments that you need to watch because each one has key insights that will help you plan and execute your daily business with the end in mind. Until then, be great at all you do.